What happened behind the scenes of Euphoria was even darker than the show itself. At the time of its premiere, it seemed unstoppable. Finally, HBO had found its teenage phenomenon. But something changed. Behind the neon lights, the glitter makeup, and the perfect shots, Euphoria began to transform into something else. An increasingly chaotic filming, actors abandoning the project, cancellations, and finally, a tragedy that changed everything. Those who managed to make it out of this disaster unscathed are now the titans leading the industry. And the rest were marked forever. Whether you're a fan of the show or not, settle in and pay close attention. To understand how we went from prestige to absolute chaos, we are going to walk step by step through the chain of events that ended up dragging the project toward its collapse. If you're ready, let's begin. On this channel, we've already learned that when a project shines with intense brightness, it's usually because something is on fire on the other side of the camera. But to begin to understand the collapse of Euphoria, we have to go back to the very beginning of this story. Let's rewind a decade. The year was 2016, and HBO was the undisputed king of prestige television. As the home of The Sopranos, Game of Thrones, The Wire, and True Detective, it had little to envy from other networks. But in the corporate hallways, executives were talking about only one thing. It's a fear that affects us all, but especially the entertainment industry. Their audience was aging, and the new demographic they needed to capture is the most difficult in history. Generation Z doesn't have the habit of tuning into a TV network on Sunday nights. They are on Instagram, on YouTube, consuming the dizzying algorithm of the internet. Eventually, we would recognize them mostly for their TikTok consumption and their abandonment of horizontal formats. If HBO wanted to survive the long night of the coming decade, it needed young blood. They could have spent months, even years, debating the solution, until a director appeared who seemed to truly understand the youth, Sam Levinson. Before becoming the architect of the series that would define a generation, Levinson was born right into the very heart of the industry. As the son of Barry Levinson, one of Hollywood's most respected directors, Sam grew up surrounded by film sets and awards. But that level of prestige always comes with a price. For the young heir, the pressure and the proximity to power translated into total instability. During his youth, he trapped himself in a spiral of addiction, anxiety, and rehab clinics. His mind fractured, though that emotional descent wouldn't be in vain. Years later, he would admit that much of Euphoria's DNA was born directly from that stage of his life. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. His journey behind the camera began quietly. In 2010, he earned his first screenwriting credit on Operation Endgame, and a year later he made his directorial debut with Another Happy Day. His name began circulating within the system, leading him to co-write the HBO film The Wizard of Lies, directed by his own father. By then, network executives already had their eye on him, but it was the release of Assassination Nation that completely won them over. The film split critics down the middle. Some celebrated it as a bold stroke of genius, while others trashed it as narcissistic. One way or another, everyone agreed on one thing. This director was not interested in telling comfortable or conventional stories. Desperate to find a series that would connect with the elusive teenage audience, HBO executives called him into a meeting. Levinson accepted without fear of rejection, and began mapping out a proposal that was as brilliant as it was disturbing. Taking the premise of a dark Israeli television format and rewriting it completely, injecting it with the rawness of his own personal traumas. From that toxic and fascinating mix, the phenomenon that would change the rules of television and the lives of everyone involved forever began to take shape. But wait, did you know Euphoria already existed on another continent? HBO's best-kept secret is that this project was never an original idea by Sam Levinson. The concept already existed on the other side of the world, but it had a much more monstrous form. In 2012, Israeli television premiered a miniseries of the same name created by Ron Lesham and Daphne Levin. Directly inspired by the real-life tragedy of a teenager named Ronan Levy, it was a raw story without any kind of moral filter. But when the format landed in the United States, Levinson's vision completely dismantled that essence. The director wanted to build a narcotic journey. He took the darkness of the Israeli format and injected it with Hollywood venom. In doing so, he created a parallel universe where teenage angst was presented through neon lights, glitter makeup, and hypnotic sound design. Pain went from being uncomfortable to watch to being seductive and aspirational. In other words, highly marketable. HBO saw the perfect formula to trigger a cultural phenomenon and took the bait without asking questions. But by buying into the concept, they also signed the contract that would eventually destroy the series from within. They handed Sam Levinson absolute power. In the modern television industry, big-budget shows survive thanks to a vital defense mechanism: the writer's room. It's a committee of writers who structure the plot, contain egos, and curb the destructive impulses of creators to keep the train from derailing. Levinson killed that system before even starting. He didn't want collaborators of any kind. He would write every line of dialogue, decide every camera movement, and control every last tear on his actors' faces. The executives at HBO believed they had discovered a visionary director, not realizing they had just created an untouchable figure. But in Hollywood, untouchable gods always end up demanding sacrifices. With HBO's blank check on the table, Levinson began adapting the format, until a thought stopped him. A provocative script wasn't going to be enough to sustain his empire. He needed faces that embodied the aesthetic of the internet. Young people willing to let themselves be molded, and, above all, figures who would function as the perfect bait for Gen Z. If the public didn't obsess over them from the first minute, the experiment was dead before it even started. The center of gravity on this chessboard had to be magnetic. Levinson was so certain of this that he developed the project with one fixed image in mind: Zendaya. To millions of viewers, Zendaya Marie Stormer Coleman was just another face from the Disney Channel. In her early 20s, she was only just beginning to break into the film universe with her first steps in franchises like Marvel. But Levinson wasn't about to let her potential stay trapped in that mold. He saw something different in her. He had to convince her to join the project before it was too late. Levinson set up a meeting with the actress. As soon as he saw her, he didn't hesitate to confess that he had imagined Rue with her face from the very beginning. Today, Zendaya is a consolidated and respected figure, but at that moment, even she wasn't convinced she could handle such a dark and self-destructive character. During that first meeting, she asked him honestly, "What have I done in my career to show I can do this?" Levinson told her he wasn't interested in what she had already done, but in everything she had yet to achieve. It was then that the actress decided to accept the challenge, and Rue's journey began. The second piece of the puzzle was Hunter Schafer. Born in North Carolina, her path to acting followed a completely different road than her castmates. Before Euphoria, Hunter was primarily recognized as a model and visual artist. Her activism for trans rights had made her a rising voice in the American cultural conversation. But she didn't have a solid acting background. Far from seeing this as a weakness, Levinson found it the ultimate reason to choose her. Through Hunter, he built Jules as an authentic presence within his fiction, creating a character that felt almost like a documentary. Schafer didn't just take on the challenge. Over time, she would become one of the few people Levinson would allow to actively participate in the development of his narrative universe. He had his protagonists. Now he needed the villain. In his search for the ultimate antagonist, the director found a young man with nothing to lose. Jacob Elordi had just starred in the teen franchise The Kissing Booth on Netflix, and was practically on the street, penniless, sleeping wherever he could in Los Angeles. He arrived at the audition so overwhelmed by failure that he forgot his lines completely. In that situation, Levinson saw the opportunity to destroy the pretty boy image and transform him into Nate Jacobs, a sociopath designed to explore the most toxic zones of modern masculinity. One by one, he filled out the cast. Key pieces like Sydney Sweeney, Alexa Demi, Maud Apatow, and Barbie Ferreira began to gravitate around the core. Levinson had managed to assemble the future of pop culture. But that wasn't all. In the middle of that millimetric ecosystem, the most unpredictable piece of all appeared. Angus Cloud was not part of the plan. In the early drafts of the script, Fezco was barely a minor character assisting Rue's plot. But everything changed when a casting assistant saw Angus walking the streets of New York and decided to approach him. Cloud was so skeptical of the pitch that he refused to give his number, convinced it was a scam. He wasn't aspiring to fame. He wasn't looking for a career in the industry. But he knew Zendaya from childhood and was curious to see where fate might lead him. When he finally agreed to audition, his natural magnetism altered the logic of the character. Levinson rewrote Fezco's story to give him a much larger role in the long run. What no one could imagine then was that his story would have a tragic end. But there are still several years to go before we reach that moment. With the cast locked in, production for Euphoria began in 2018 in Los Angeles. From the very start, the filming schedule made it clear that this wouldn't follow the usual rules of television. Many scenes were captured exclusively at night, forcing the crew to adapt to an inverted life cycle that blurred their sense of time. Some cast members described the experience as a constant state of disorientation, though that was nothing compared to the nightmare of being on a set under Levinson's obsessive eye. The first red flag appeared when Levinson arrived for filming and showed a total dislike for traditional methods. The shot list, a basic organizational tool for any director, was often tossed aside in favor of his impulse to improvise camera movements and rewrite dialogue while the actors were already standing standing there. This forced the crew to endure marathon workdays of 16 to 18 hours. In this early stage, the cast and technicians accepted the exhaustion in the name of art, though this logistical chaos began to cast a long shadow over the director. The cast's commitment was just as extreme. Zendaya researched real cases of youth addiction to build Rue, while Hunter Schafer actively helped develop her character by using her own life experiences. The intensity of this emotional laboratory also impacted Ferreira, Sweeney, and the rest of the cast, sometimes pushing them to their physical limits. During a particularly violent take in Episode 8, Jacob Elordi and Eric Dane had a confrontation so intense that Elordi ended up bleeding and vomiting on the side of the set after repeating the take several times under heavy emotional stress. The technical side offered no relief either. Alongside cinematographer Marcel Rev, Levinson became obsessed with developing a visual language that represented every emotion the characters felt. The entire season was a technical and physical challenge, but two sequences summed up the project's ambition. The rotating room scene in the pilot, designed to show Rue's collapse, required building a completely mobile set. Instead of using digital effects, the team built a physical hallway inside a giant motorized gyroscope. The camera was fixed to the structure, and as the room rotated 360 degrees, the actors and crew had to synchronize every movement with millimetric precision. The result was hypnotic, but the process involved endless retakes and grueling days. Something similar happened with the carnival scene in the fourth episode. What looks like a stunning visual sequence on screen actually required 6 straight nights of filming outdoors at a large fairground. The area was covered in dust, and the nighttime California cold made the working conditions brutal. Zendaya, who was already carrying an extreme emotional burden while constantly running back and forth across the set, suffered the consequences and needed to use an inhaler just to breathe between takes. The filming wrapped with the crew exhausted, but with visually striking footage in hand. All that was left was to see how the public would react to an experiment built on tension, chaos, and beauty, a project that had already begun to rewrite its own rules. When Euphoria premiered in June 2019, what seemed like a fleeting attempt to understand youth ended up becoming something much larger. It didn't just appeal to Gen Z, it eclipsed the conversation worldwide. And here's a personal anecdote. Even my mother watched it and came to argue with me that it didn't grab her at all. Of course, Levinson put all his energy into convincing a single audience. Even so, the project was so impactful that it managed to transform into a true cultural phenomenon. HBO had done it. Levinson had proven he could match his father's recognition. Zendaya forever destroyed her Disney star image, consolidating herself as a prestige actress, and shortly after, becoming the youngest person to win the Emmy for Best Lead Actress in a Drama Series. Hunter Schafer was instantly elevated to the status of a muse, and the rest of the cast was catapulted to global stardom at a speed none of them seemed prepared to handle. The conversation about Euphoria was no longer just happening on television. It was in fashion, in makeup, in music, and all over social media. Even Leonardo DiCaprio went on record saying he loved the series. It was, apparently, the birth of a new canon. But that season of success is now a distant memory. Today, the landscape is radically different. The most recent season didn't spark the same devotion we just described, but rather a mix of skepticism and distaste. How did we go from absolute prestige to constant questioning? Was it Levinson's vision that ultimately became unsustainable? Was it the explosive growth of the cast's fame? Or was it the industry context that finally dragged the phenomenon down? The debut of Euphoria crowned Levinson and company. HBO responded automatically and greenlit a continuation. For some, it would be the final step towards superstardom. For others, it would be the foundation of future conflicts. And for certain figures, the second season would mark their very last contact with this project. One of the most frequent complaints in the streaming era is that shows take longer and longer to release new seasons. If there's one title that could head that list, it's Euphoria. But at least initially, the delay was the result of a phenomenon that paralyzed the entire industry, the COVID-19 pandemic. Filming for the second season could only begin in 2021, under strict sanitary protocols that completely changed the production dynamics. However, no external restriction, not even the virus itself, would be as demanding as Sam Levinson's second round. By this point, the creator had already shown that he wasn't afraid to get into conflicts, to represent and understand youth. In the first season, Levinson had crossed a line that earned him international backlash by including an animated sequence based on a fan fiction involving singers Harry Styles and Louis Tomlinson. Despite Tomlinson publicly stating he never gave permission for his image to be used that way, Levinson stood his ground, claiming he was merely portraying internet culture. During the production of the second season, the debate over nudity and graphic sequences returned even stronger. Only this time, it didn't come from critics or the public. It came from inside the set. Sydney Sweeney had gained significant narrative weight in this installment, but that growth came with an unpayable cost. Upon reading the scripts for the new episodes, she realized that Levinson intended for her to be exposed for almost the entire season. At first, she tried to give it her all, but as the most explicit scenes were captured, the actress's discomfort reached its limit. One afternoon, exhausted, she stopped everything. She went to find the director and told him, face to face, that there were shots that simply added nothing to the story. Levinson, for the first time, adopted a docile stance. He agreed with her and cut the scenes the actress deemed unnecessary. That image of an understanding director seemed to hold up shortly after with Minka Kelly. It was her first day of filming. The cameras were ready, but when Kelly read that the scene required her character to let her dress fall to the floor, she stood her ground. She said she wasn't going to do it, and once again, Levinson bowed his head and accepted her decision without a single complaint. That patience was a surprise to the whole crew, but peace on the set had an expiration date. Deep down, Levinson was still operating under the same old system, and when he felt he was losing absolute control, the filming caught fire again. The most notorious and toxic case was his war against Barbie Ferreira. Kat had been the heart of the first season, an icon of empowerment that the audience loved. But for this second installment, Levinson decided to include an eating disorder. When Ferreira read what they wanted to do with her character, she flatly refused. She told the creator that this arc ruined all of Kat's development. Levinson didn't like having his vision questioned, and it quickly escalated into a brutal confrontation on set. There were screams and hostility until the situation became so suffocating that Ferreira turned around and walked off the filming. Any other showrunner would have halted production or fired the actress. But Levinson chose psychological punishment. When Ferreira returned to the set, she discovered her character had been erased from the plot. Levinson crossed out her lines of dialogue and reduced her to a mere spectator who still had to fulfill her endless workdays just to watch her co-stars act. After months of suffering this mental and professional attrition, Ferreira announced her definitive departure from the series. Levinson had executed one of the public's favorite characters just to leave a chilling message for the rest of the cast. He could yield on the visuals, but if anyone had something to say about his ideas or his script, it would be their last word on that set. With that stress in mind, the cast focused more than ever on finishing the season, and Levinson on making things even more complicated. With HBO's money on his side, the director teamed up again with Marcel Rev to film much of the plot on 35mm Kodak Ektachrome film, a practically obsolete format. This decision meant extremely complex developing processes and a tiny margin of error for the actors. It must be said, any film student would go crazy to have that, but filming on celluloid without a defined shot list and rewriting the script on the set turned the production into a true meat grinder. The toughest sequence took place during the New Year's Eve party setting. It was captured exclusively at night for over a week. This exhausted the entire crew, but especially Jacob Elordi, who compared his experience to being in hell, trapped in a party you can't leave. And that wasn't the worst part. The workdays began to stretch to inhuman levels, sometimes reaching nearly 20 uninterrupted hours of work, with extras sleeping on the floor and the technical crew on the verge of physical collapse. When the production calendar reached its end, concern reached the higher-ups at HBO. Word of mouth had already started to spread, and they feared more departures, or worse, lawsuits from Sweeney or Ferreira. They had managed to capture the audience, but perhaps Levinson went too far this time. Would the journey be worth it? We know well that the consequences would not be long in coming. But there was still another year to go. When the second season finally premiered, HBO saw that Levinson had done it again, and the executives breathed a sigh of relief. Controversies were the order of the day, but regardless, Euphoria had just become the fourth most watched series in HBO history. The TV network smiled at the director once again, and this time, they didn't just approve a third season, they also decided to reward him by giving him absolute control and a blank check for a new project, The Idol. What no one in the HBO offices knew was that the monster birthed in the late-night hallways of Euphoria was about to unleash one of the greatest disasters, humiliations, and cancellations in the industry. When HBO announced The Idol, the world was shook by the idea of a new original project co-created alongside Abel Tesfaye, better known as The Weeknd. The plot promised to uncover the darkest, boldest side of the Hollywood music industry. But what it actually ended up exposing was Levinson himself. Rumors that something was deeply wrong began to leak months before the premiere. Devastating reports brought to light a production process that looked like a toxic hell, even worse than Euphoria. The series was originally in the hands of director Amy Seimetz, who had already filmed nearly 80% of the season. However, The Weeknd reportedly didn't like that the story was taking on a too feminine perspective. HBO's solution was to fire the director, throw millions of dollars of finished footage into the trash, and call Sam Levinson to take absolute control, rewriting and refilming almost everything under his own vision. The result was a chaotic set with no finished scripts and a working environment that an explosive Rolling Stone article dubbed HBO's idol-making fantasy of torture porn. The bubble finally burst in May 2023 at the prestigious Cannes Film Festival. From the very first screening, The Idol was killed by global critics. It was accused of visually exploiting the suffering of its protagonist, Lily Rose Depp, prioritizing shock value and explicit scenes over any narrative coherence. The Weeknd took his share of the hits, but Levinson's reputation reached a point of no return. The director's signature label that had protected him during the abuses on the set of Euphoria was ripped away, exposing a problematic creator disconnected from reality. This radioactive disaster had a direct and inevitable impact on his masterpiece. Although The Idol was canceled and buried after just 5 episodes, the stain quickly spread to the Euphoria universe. The public conversation shifted completely. The question was no longer whether Sam Levinson could top the cultural phenomenon of his first 2 seasons. The question now was whether the public, the critics, and his own cast would be willing to put up with him one more time. While Levinson's empire was falling to pieces, his muses were traveling the exact opposite path. It's very likely that in the last few years, you've seen Zendaya's face more often than your own family's. Between blockbusters like Dune, the Spider-Man saga, and the phenomenon of challengers, the actress established herself as one of Hollywood's favorite faces. In parallel, Sydney Sweeney signed onto new projects and headlined her own controversies, while Jacob Elordi moved on to star in acclaimed films like Priscilla and Saltburn. This created a new problem. Coordinating the schedules of a group of young stars who now led the fashion world, dominated award seasons, and were filming on different continents was impossible. The 3rd season of Euphoria began to face real danger. Levinson was at a low point, and his cast had no intention of looking back. Everything indicated that the story was going to fade into the oblivion of collapsed schedules and broken egos, until reality broke down the door in the worst way possible. In the moment of greatest uncertainty, a brutal and unexpected tragedy struck the industry, forcing this group of scattered stars to stop their flight and reunite once more. On July 31, 2023, Angus Cloud, the actor who brought the beloved Fezco to life, left us forever at the young age of 25. The news paralyzed Hollywood and devastated an audience that had found in his character the only moral compass in a sea of cynicism. The streets of Oakland, his hometown, were filled with murals painted by fans to honor his memory. The cast was left heartbroken. Even Levinson issued a statement where he seemed genuinely broken, confessing that there was no one quite like him, and that he was too special, too talented, and way too young to leave us so soon. For their part, HBO and the Max platform acted immediately, adding black and white commemorative plaques to the beginning of the episodes to acknowledge the viewer's grief. Unlike his castmates, Angus wasn't a Hollywood star. His authenticity ended up piercing through the screen. The darkness and excesses that Euphoria worked so hard to highlight in fiction had claimed the highest possible price in the real world. Following the painful loss of Angus and the disastrous failure of The Idol, the fate of Euphoria was hanging by a thread, and as if the universe wanted to give Levinson a lesson in humility, the entire industry shut down. The historic strikes of 2023 by writers and actors brought Hollywood to a complete standstill. When the picket lines finally came down, the landscape was bleak. Coordinating the schedules of a cast that had become global superstars was nearly impossible, while Levinson, struck by grief and creatively blocked, kept rewriting scripts in a loop that began to wear out HBO's patience. In parallel, the media machine kept turning. While the lead actresses walked European red carpets, the rest of the team faced the consequences of a frozen production. Nika King, who plays Rue's mother, went as far as confessing she hadn't been able to pay her rent for months. Amidst awkward laughter, she even publicly asked Zendaya to stop walking the runways in Paris and get back to the set. To make matters worse, there was a biological problem no 35mm camera could hide. The cast had grown up. Pretending that actors pushing 30 were still worried about the senior prom was bordering on the ridiculous. Cornered by the clock and the pressure, Levinson finally gave up part of his control. That's when HBO stepped in with a definitive decision. The 3rd season would arrive on April 12, 2026, incorporating a 5-year time jump into adulthood. And it would be the final act. No more blank checks, 20-hour workdays, lawsuits, or cancellations. The first look at this new stage confirmed a complete shift in tone. For some, the series now feels closer to a Grand Theft Auto mission or a Tarantino movie than the neon and glitter drama that had conquered an entire generation. While some viewers celebrate this twist, others accuse the director of clinging to the same controversial gaze toward his female characters. One way or another, the stage is set for the final act. Levinson has one last chance to achieve a worthy ending, or let his masterpiece remain buried forever. Euphoria was born as the definitive portrait of a broken generation, but it ended up being destroyed by the very chaos it tried to represent. Sam Levinson's unrestrained ambition revolutionized contemporary television and gave us unforgettable images. But it also proved that even Hollywood has its limits. Now we want to hear from you. What do you think was the true breaking point for Euphoria? Are you going to watch the final season? Let us know in the comments. How many times have you seen clips or memes from The Boys? The grotesque scenes this show is known for are everywhere on the internet, but few people